James Mann, why did you write this book now?
Well, now actually is when I finished it. I began thinking about writing this book a good 8 or 10 years ago when I was a reporter covering American policy towards China, and I actually began writing the book 3 or 4 years ago, began doing the research then. But the genesis of the book, it was in my years as a correspondent in Beijing when I noticed there was what I call in the title a curious relationship between the United States and China.
What do you mean by that? Explain curious relationship.
Well, curious at that time when I was in Beijing meant that the relationship was secretive and that China got treated in a way that many other countries didn't. There was obviously a reason for that. China was America's partner, in Henry Kissinger's words, as I was later to discover, a tacit ally with the United States in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. That meant both big things and small. I mean, in big terms, that meant the United States and China were working together to fight, for example, a covert war in Afghanistan, supporting the Afghan guerrillas against the Soviet Union. Small things. I lived as a correspondent in Beijing in a diplomatic compound, as all other correspondents did, alongside American diplomats. And you would find sort of the texture of America's relationship with China day in and day out. I remember one night asking an American diplomat what he was doing the next day, and he said, well, we're going to go get the list of who in China becomes a Fulbright scholar, gets Fulbright scholarships to the United States. And I said, sort of naively, I thought the United States picks the Fulbright scholars. And the guy kind of laughed, and he said, well, that's the way it works around the world. In China, China picks the Fulbright scholars, and they give us a list, and then we pick them based on their list. So in big ways and small, the relationship was curious.
Is this a history of policy, or is it a history of personalities?
It's both. I try to cover all of the policy disputes from the beginning and to show the personalities at work at the same time. I tried to make this not just a book about American policy towards China, but how foreign policy is made in Washington. There are common myths around the country that this foreign policy is a very lofty, impersonal process. In fact, it's a collection of personalities and disputes in which policy is one component, but not the only component. Personalities count too.
So then, who are the key personalities in this book?
Well, there are several different. There are the American presidents, from Nixon to Clinton. There are the top policymakers, usually the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. Sometimes Secretaries of Defense play a role. And then there are what I would call the working level people. Working level may be a little bit too low for these people. American ambassadors played an important role. So in the book you find a great deal of attention to ambassadors such as Leonard Woodcock, Winston Lord, Ambassador Hummel, Arthur Hummel in between them, and James Lilly. And then there are working level people in Washington. There's an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia who sometimes plays a role. And all of these are the online people. And sometimes, although high-level decisions get made, it's the working levels that have to do it on the spot. So one of the little incidents in the book, this is a day or two, a couple days after the Tiananmen Square crackdown, and the Chinese dissident Fang Lijie, afraid for his life, goes and asks for asylum or for refuge in the American embassy in Beijing. He goes in there, and the American embassy in Beijing at the time has been debating, what do we do if masses of ordinary Chinese come in and ask us for asylum? And they've said, well, we can't do it. We're going to turn them away. So when Fang Lijie, who's at the time China's most famous dissident, goes in, the American embassy sort of persuades him that he really doesn't want to be there, and he goes back out on the street. What happens? A working level official in Washington hears about this, he says, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" And quickly tells them to turn it around, to go back and ask Fang Lijie to take him back into the embassy. This is not some decision made at the presidential level. This is at the working level.
You begin, as you said, with President Richard Nixon, late 60s. Why not begin in 1949?
Well, that's possible. There is a long hiatus. There are very good books on America's policy, or some might say lack of policy, towards China in the 50s and 60s. This was meant to cover the opening to China and then the efforts to hold together this opening after Tiananmen Square. Those are the periods I see as a unit.
When did Richard Nixon become interested in China, do you think?
I found, Nixon, when he was, after he made his famous trip to Beijing in 1972, he would always refer people back to an article he wrote in the 1968 campaign. It was for Foreign Affairs magazine. And he said in writing in that article, we need a new policy towards China. He didn't really say what it was or what he would do. I found actually that Nixon, and he told Zhou Enlai this in Beijing, Nixon all through the mid-60s, at that point, he's a defeated politician. He's lost not only the presidency, but he's lost raised his effort to be governor of California. He's out traveling. He travels around Asia, and he seems to be reevaluating his policy as he does. So in the book, I interviewed some Foreign Service officers who had what must have seemed to them at the time to be the thankless job of serving as Richard Nixon's embassy control officer when this losing Republican candidate is traveling around Asia. And they described him as sort of reflecting, well, we can't support Chiang Kai-shek forever. We need some kind of policy.
Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of
nationalist China, then on Taiwan, now on Taiwan. And I was skeptical of these. I mean, I'm now interviewing people in 1996, let's say, about things they knew after they, of course, knew that Nixon had opened to China. So it's possible that they could be exaggerating the importance of what he said. But then I found written evidence of the same thing, written in 1968. The American ambassador to India, a guy named Chester Bowles, writing back to Dean Rusk, Nixon came through here, and he's had some pretty good ideas, except for a bit of craziness about China, that maybe we should have as good or better relations with China as with the Soviet Union.
Henry Kissinger, in fact, in a moment you reflect in your book, reacted with great skepticism, it seems, when
after Nixon took office, very soon after Nixon took office, in February of 1969, Kissinger comes back into his suite at the National Security Council and sort of rolls his eyes. Alexander Haig remembers this. He was Kissinger's deputy. Rolls his eyes and says, "China, the boss wants to do something about improved relations with China," as though he thought Nixon was crazy. I'm sure he did. It must have seemed a wild-eyed idea at the time.
Was it China that motivated the president, do you think? Was it politics, domestic politics?
Well, no one could have been closer to the heart of the political aspects of American isolation of China than Richard Nixon. He was one of the main anti-communist leaders of the late 40s and early 50s. So when he's traveling, he's beginning to ask himself, I think, does this make sense? So yeah, it is China that is the driving force.
What role does the Soviet Union play in his calculation, do you think?
Well, the Soviet Union really, as it had a tendency to do, did something that was silly and counterproductive, in effect shot itself in the foot. In the early months of 1969, just as Nixon's taking office, there are a series of border skirmishes between China and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet ambassador to Washington, Anatoly Dobrinin, comes in and begins talking to Henry Kissinger about these and saying, I hope you don't take the Chinese seriously, and I hope you're not sympathetic to the Chinese, and really calling Kissinger's attention to this and prompting Kissinger now to think through the implications of an improved American relationship with China.
Before the famous trip to Beijing that Nixon took with Kissinger in '72, there were years of overtures made. What was the political climate like, do you think, in the United States at that time when these overtures were being made?
Well, it's interesting. There were, as you say, there were overtures first through diplomatic channels and private ones. The American political attitude towards China really hadn't moved since the 60s, but Nixon, in particular, was very skillfully beginning to change the politics. So I found memos in which Nixon is beginning to think through how to move the right wing of the Republican Party. At that time, what was called in American politics the China lobby was led by a congressman named Walter Judd, and there was a Senator, Carl Mundt. And I found memos of Nixon telling Kissinger in 1969, before there really are any contacts between the United States and China, talk to Senator Mundt, talk to Walter Judd, let him know what we're doing. Nixon is very carefully bringing along the right wing of the party. And throughout that four-year term, he was very skillful at doing that. After he goes to China, after Henry Kissinger goes to China, he sends Ronald Reagan, then the governor of California and the strongest supporter, with the possible exception of Barry Goldwater, of nationalist China. Nixon sends Reagan to Taiwan to help explain the policy, and that helps bring Reagan along. Reagan later regrets making this trip. But Nixon is very skillfully changing the political climate in the United States.
What do you think we were wanting out of China, and what do you think China was wanting out of the United States with these opening moves at reestablishing some kind of communication?
Well, Nixon actually tried to figure that out himself. And as part of my research, I ran across the handwritten notes that he made to himself, actually on the eve of the trip, and then during the trip. And he sits down, I'll even read them to you, because they really lay it all out. He sits down and he scribbles, what do they want? 1, build up their world credentials. 2, Taiwan, meaning they want American concessions on Taiwan. 3, get the U.S. out of Asia. What do we want? Indochina, he writes. By that he means he wants China's help in a peace settlement in Vietnam. Restrain Chinese communist expansion in Asia, and then reduce the threat of a confrontation by a Chinese superpower. What do we both want? Reduce the danger of confrontation and conflict. We want a more stable Asia, and we want a restraint on the USSR. That's really the summary of the way Nixon saw it, and a fairly accurate summary of I think, the way the foreign policy apparatus saw it.
Where did you see these notes, by the way?
They were in the National Archives. There's a handwriting file in the Nixon collection, and I found them there.
So, February 1972, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger go to China.
Right.
1972, an election year.
That's right. And that was certainly part of it. Domestic politics was a part of the Nixon opening from the start. One of the things that the United States asks the Chinese leadership for that doesn't show up in the Nixon and Kissinger memoirs is what amounts to an exclusive franchise for the Republican Party and for themselves on the opening to China. So there's a request, no visits by leading Democratic candidates before Nixon's trip. No other Democratic politicians either. So no Senator Mansfield, who's the Democrats' leading expert on Asia at the time. No Ted Kennedy. No Muskie. No McGovern. They want the franchise on it. Then that isn't quite enough. They're aware that American anti-war leaders have gone to Hanoi, so they get a promise from the Chinese, no leaders of the anti-war movement either. And they successfully make sure that the opening to China goes to the credit of the Republican Party.
There are other requests that are made. You cite a note, I believe, from Alexander Haig at that time, a request made to the Chinese. Mr. Haig told Zhou Enlai on a previous trip, in view of the opposition from left and right in the U.S. to Nixon's China policy, he writes, "It is crucial that there be no public embarrassment to the president as a result of his visit to Beijing." What does this mean? And
actually, that's the sort of request that many American politicians, we want this trip to go well. We don't want anything to embarrass us. Make sure this is a smooth trip. Of course, when you step back from that, you realize that it seems like a reasonable request, but in some ways it gives the Chinese tremendous leverage over the United States. What is the United States, or what are these political leaders willing to give in order to make sure that there's no embarrassment?
Did the trip go well then?
The trip went very well, yes.
As measured how?
As measured by the lack of incident, and as measured, I would say, by the fact that the main disagreement on the trip was kept entirely from the American press corps. There was a furious disagreement among the Americans during this trip about the communique that would be issued at the end, the famous Shanghai communique. And this is now well fleshed out in the documents. The American Secretary of State, William Rogers, the Assistant Secretary of State, Marshall Green, objected to the communique. This is now available to us in history, but the trip went well, and that the press corps really never learned of this at all.
This was a very famous picture that resulted from the meeting between Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon. Who are the other individuals in this meeting?
Let's see. We have, in the center, we have Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon. On the very left, far left, we have Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier. The two other Chinese women are Nancy Tang, one of the translators, and Wang Hairong, who was actually Mao's niece and a foreign ministry official. And lastly, because when people saw this picture, they saw only the middle. They saw Mao to Kissinger, or maybe Zhou Enlai as well. Winston Lord, who is the second from the right, and who's cropped out of the picture. Why is he cropped out of the picture? Well, maybe for aesthetic and photographic reasons, but also because he's occupying a chair which might otherwise have been taken by William Rogers, the Secretary of State, who was kept out of the meeting, was told there just wasn't room for him.
Now, who is Winston Lord, and why was he sitting here and not the Secretary of State, William Rogers?
Well, he is the assistant, the young assistant at the time to Henry Kissinger, and he's going to take notes for Henry Kissinger. He's Kissinger's personal aide. The significance is not so much that he's in the meeting as the fact that Rogers is out of it.
And what is the significance of that?
Well, throughout this trip, William Rogers is kept out of all of the meetings. Nixon and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, meet once a day in Beijing, 3 hours at a time. And William Rogers is in none of these meetings, nor is he permitted to take part in the negotiations on the communique, which is issued at the end of the trip. He's told to go off and negotiate with the Chinese foreign minister, Ji Pengfei. And he's really relegated to the margins on this trip. They really didn't want him in it. This was part and parcel of Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, gaining supremacy over the State Department. As you know, he becomes the Secretary of State the following year.
You write throughout your book that of Kissinger's focus on secrecy.
Yeah, at the beginning of this opening, I would say that the secrecy was necessary, was understandable. They were trying to carry out a diplomatic initiative that was unprecedented and could have been scuttled very easily before it got started.
How much?
After that, the secrecy really took on a life of its own. The handful of people who were involved, who were the most closely involved, developed a personal stake in it. And they...
Kissinger first among them, it sounds like.
Certainly, yeah. And they really perpetuated the secrecy. This was, they felt that, I mean, the secrecy really took on a life of its own. And it lasted well into the 80s. At the end of the 1980s, another of Henry Kissinger's aides, Brent Scowcroft, by then the National Security Advisor, makes a secret trip to Beijing and discovers that it's now counterproductive, that you lose American political support when the secrecy is too great. But it really lasts through those 2 decades.
Before we move on, how do you think Henry Kissinger comes off in your book?
Well, you know, Henry Kissinger comes off certainly as secretive and manipulative. I don't think he finds in there, I have no idea, but think that these are criticisms that he's heard before. They may be sort of laid out in a narrative form more than he's seen them before, but I'm not sure these are new criticisms to him.
Richard Nixon returns home. He's reelected for another term. He promises 2 things, as I understand from your book. First, to normalize relations with China.
Right.
And second, there are a set of secret promises made on the issue of Taiwan.
He, first Kissinger, on his secret trip in '71, and then Richard Nixon, make a series of promises that go beyond those in the Shanghai Communique. That the United States will not support independence for Taiwan. They will not support a policy of one China, one Taiwan. They also make some secret promises about Japan, which really haven't received much attention before.
And what are those?
He promised that as the United States was withdrawing its forces from Taiwan, it would do its best to make sure that Japan didn't go in. That Japan wouldn't either put troops there or regain influence in Taiwan. And then they go beyond that, and they say the United States will do its best to limit Japanese influence in other Asian countries too, such as South Korea, such as even Indonesia. So this is, of course, you know, what's striking about this, you have to step back and say, wait a minute, Japan's an ally, a military ally of the United States. The United States doesn't have even diplomatic relations with China. The United States is giving some promises to China or making some overtures regarding its limiting the influence of its military ally.
How does China policy evolve and change during the administrations of Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter?
Well, it's interesting. Gerald Ford, when he took office, intended to change China policy very little. You have to step back. On Nixon's resignation, the Chinese are terrified, and in a way you can understand. Here, Nixon and Kissinger have been telling them over and over and over again, watch what we do, not what we say. Don't pay attention to the official statements of the State Department. Don't pay attention to the public statements of the government. Just pay attention to what we're telling you. These are all private relationships. They're private assurances. Now Nixon's leaving.
And beyond Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, and to the degree that he was involved, Mao Zedong, there were, you write in your book, little, if any, contact between the two nations.
That's right. This is not, the whole point of this opening is it's not an institutional relationship. There are efforts in these early years to set up a couple of umbrella organizations, but this isn't institutionalized. This isn't the State Department. This is a very personalized relationship. So the Chinese, who tend to see things in personal terms anyway, are terrified. And the one little unknown drama of that famous day that some of your viewers remember in 1974 when Richard Nixon gets on the helicopter and leaves is that the Chinese ambassador is being brought into the White House and being told by Kissinger first, don't worry, all the promises we made still stand, and then he's being brought down the hall to the new president who has a few other things to do, his first hours in office, and being told by Jerry Ford, all these promises still stand. That was the original intention, that everything would stay the same, and among those promises was that the United States would establish relations with China.
And
however, two things happened. One involved American foreign policy and one domestic politics. Foreign policy, the United States suffers the end of its defeat in Vietnam in April of 1975. People are flown off on the helicopters from the roof of the American embassy. It's a very stinging defeat. And in American politics, Ronald Reagan from the right begins to challenge Gerry Ford for the Republican nomination. Those two factors put together, and even then George Bush, who's the unofficial ambassador to Beijing, in Beijing, starts cabling, you better think really carefully about normalizing relations. By the summer of '75, the United States has decided, the Ford administration has decided, we can't do this. We can't follow through on our promise, not till after the '76 elections. The Chinese are furious. They've now been promised by Nixon and by Ford that they're going to get diplomatic relations. And they're not going to get it. So relations become quite chilly. And in order to keep these relations going, the Ford administration then takes other kinds of actions, very subtle, not noticed much at the time, but very important. They begin, in order to keep China happy, to open the way for technology transfers to China and the very beginnings of military relations with China. These are steps which aren't noticed at the time, and they're not very far-reaching, but they're the beginning of something very important.
And throughout this period as well, you also write that there was a great deal of intelligence sharing back and forth between the United States and China.
Right. It started out on an ad hoc basis. So
what kind of intelligence is exchanged?
Well, of course, the thing that the Americans figure the Chinese are most interested in, and they are, is information about Soviet troop deployments near China's border. So as early as 1971, and also on Nixon's trip, the United States begins giving China some military intelligence. And through the early 1970s, this picks up. In fact, the guy who was doing this, the guy assigned to do this, it was his job on these trips to Beijing, is the later National Security Advisor, Bud McFarlane. He's the guy who briefs the Chinese on intelligence matters. Now, this proceeds to the point where by the end of the decade, under the Carter administration, it becomes a formal intelligence relationship. And you have then a good decade or more in which there is a formal intelligence relationship. The directors of the CIA, like Bill Casey, go over there. They're always asked to, grow a mustache, wear a funny hat, disguise yourself. But you get a formal, you get links between the CIA and the Chinese intelligence apparatus.
President Carter is often discussed as being the first president to raise the issue of human rights to that of a serious policy concern, linking it to other policy matters. Did that happen with China?
It didn't. It's funny. The Carter administration's often been criticized in its China policy for, I think, the wrong reasons. There's a Republican canard, I think, that Carter in some way gave away things concerning Taiwan. Actually, when he established diplomatic relations with China, that he made concessions on Taiwan that they wouldn't have made. I took a look at the record, and it's quite clear that the deal that he worked out in establishing relations with China was precisely what the Nixon and Ford administrations had been building towards. It wasn't any different. However, as you just said, I personally think that the Carter administration, as you look back, was, and President Carter himself, were a bit hypocritical on their human rights policies. They were, when it came to other countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, it was quite forthright on human rights. But you had, during Carter's time, the first real test of American human rights policy in China. There is a democracy wall movement in Beijing at the time, and soon after his trip to the United States, Deng Xiaoping makes sure that that democracy movement gets wrapped up. Its leaders, like Wei Jingsheng, get thrown in jail. And the Carter administration said and did remarkably little about it. It really didn't seem to take these leaders seriously or the movement seriously at all. It really sort of treated them as though they were a fringe. And as you look back in retrospect, you know, I think it was a terrible mistake.
If human rights doesn't play that larger role, to what degree during this period, the late 70s, early 80s, do issues of trade play a role in the discussion and recognition that China is still, after all, a communist nation?
Trade is interesting. It is under the Carter administration that the United States gives China most favored nation trade benefits. It happens a year after diplomatic relations are established. And this is now, MFN as it's called, or normal trade status, is a big issue in the 1990s.
Part of our vernacular now.
It is now. People don't really remember. It was really the test of how China treats the Soviet Union and China compared to one another. So the whole idea of giving China MFN started in the early 70s with an effort to give the Soviet Union most favored nation status. And after the U.S. starts talking about MFN status for the Russians, it goes to China and says, would you like them too? And there's a famous incident where Deng Xiaoping says, well, you know, we really don't need it. If you're going to give it to the Soviets, we'll take it. Fine. I compared it to the old the famous episode at the end of the 18th century, where a famous British emissary brought gifts to Beijing and was told by the Qing emperor, we have no need of your manufactures. China didn't need MFN, or so it thought. So it said. Later on, MFN for the Soviet Union gets in trouble. This is now, détente is falling apart. Senator Henry Jackson links MFN to emigration of Soviet Jews. And the U.S. can't give MFN to the Soviet Union. And finally, in the late Carter administration, they decide they're not going to treat the Soviet Union and China equally. They're not going to either both get MFN or neither get MFN. They're going to go ahead with China and not the Soviet Union. And at the time, this is treated as a great victory. So Vice President Mondale goes off and tells the Chinese that it's going to be treated on a more favorable basis than the Soviets. And he cables back in great triumph, we've delinked China and the Soviet Union. And China gets MFN.
1984, President Ronald Reagan takes a trip to China. And on his way back, there's some controversy about that trip, statements that the president made that did or did not get through to the Chinese. But on a plane back to Alaska, I believe, President, you write in your book here, flying back to Alaska aboard Air Force One, he gave a rare interview, the president, his first in a year and a half, to a pool of reporters assigned to cover him. Tired and no doubt happy to have finished a successful trip, he referred to China as a, quote, so-called communist country.
Yeah, that was silly. Reagan felt the need to justify himself and his actions towards China ideologically in a way that Nixon didn't. I mean, Nixon's whole rationale, the way he presented himself to the American people was, I'm a tough guy, I know how to stand up to the communists. It's really his approach. The way he portrayed himself with China was the way he portrayed himself with the Soviets in his famous kitchen debate in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So he had no need to justify himself ideologically, or he didn't feel the need. Reagan did. So he comes up with this formulation that China really isn't a communist country. It's
How do you arrive at that?
Communist country. Well, what he meant to say, I guess, was that China was reforming economically. It was. I don't know whether he meant to suggest it wasn't a communist country politically. If so, he was certainly deluding himself. But it was an effort to show that his credentials as an anti-communist leader or politician weren't called into question by this China trip because China wasn't a communist country.
Was trade in the 1980s really developing some kind of internal change within China, politically, economically?
No, in a very, very slow or gradual way. Yeah, first of all, the level of trade in the 1980s, it was just beginning to pick up, but was vastly less than it is in the 1990s. And second of all, China really hadn't begun to open up its political system at all. So I would, the trade, right through the 1980s, the Chinese effort was to keep it very confined and make sure that the political impact was limited.
And into the late 80s, the administration of President Bush, this gentleman, Winston Lord, is back in China.
As U.S. ambassador to China, that's right.
Two old China hands.
Right.
And what happens?
This is about 3 years into Lord's stay in China. The Chinese cities, Beijing and Shanghai, for example, are beginning to open up to a degree of social ferment. There is a degree of, a remarkable degree, actually, of interest in Western political ideas. In the 1980s, this was encouraged and favored by the regime, different leadership at the time, much more than it is now. The whole climate was different. And Lord gets invited to a seminar given by Chinese students on the grass of Beijing University.
These were organized by Wei Jiangsheng, is that right?
No, one of the organizers was not Wei Jiangsheng, who was in prison, Wang Dan, who later becomes a Chinese student leader. So he goes, and he goes with his wife, Betty Bao Lord, who's
the author.
The author, and who's down in the corner there somewhere of the picture. And he doesn't say very much. He doesn't, Lord's a pretty careful, cautious guy as it is. He simply goes there and talks to the students. And then a funny thing happens, which is he starts getting private warnings carried to him from Deng Xiaoping.
Well, what was he saying?
He hadn't said much of anything. It was the fact that he'd appeared. In fact, this particular picture appears in the South China Morning Post, the Hong Kong newspaper, a day later, and it says something pretty mundane. Lord appears with Chinese students, but I think he may have praised the leadership for all I know. He says nothing controversial. It's his presence that's controversial. The leadership is very, very nervous, much more than the Americans grasped at the time, of unrest in China.
And it's not long after that that unrest reaches its peak in Tiananmen Square.
Correct. This is the year before Tiananmen Square.
How does Tiananmen change relations between the United States and China?
Well, it changes them dramatically.
In what ways, though?
It shows, first of all, in two ways. First, it shows in ways that people find hard to deny what the basis of the Chinese leadership's claim to power is. That this is a leadership which, when necessary, holds power by force and is willing to use it. And anybody who was in Beijing at that time realizes that the use of force then was wildly unnecessary, that it was intended to scare the population out of political activity. That's the first way. And then, of course, this is all appearing. Well, let me amend that, actually. Some of this is appearing on American television, not all of it. I've always felt that if the worst of what happened at Tiananmen Square had appeared on American television, the reaction would have been far worse. Most of the bloodshed took place out of sight of the cameras. But enough of what happened did, so that there's a tremendous reaction in the United States, whereupon American public opinion becomes a factor in American relations with China in a way that it had not been for 20 years.
And it becomes an election issue. Well, campaign election,
actually,
92 election.
Before that, yeah, it definitely becomes an election issue in 1992, but before that, it becomes immediately an issue in Congress. These are American political leaders who, of course, face the voters every 2 years. You're showing, I think, a picture of Nancy Pelosi with a few zillion microphones in front of her.
Nancy Pelosi, who was very critical, as I recall, of the Bush policy toward China after Tiananmen.
She became one of the leaders, although I would say Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell was the most important, of a series of Democratic leaders who then began challenging George Bush's China policy.
This brings us up to President Clinton.
Right.
President Clinton is critical of the policies that President Bush put forward. He promises a change. Is there a change?
Yes, for a year and a half, and no. President Clinton follows through on his campaign pledge, which is that he will link any renewal of China's trade benefits to an improvement in its human rights performance. Mm-hmm. And he signs an executive order giving China a year, and it doesn't meet the standards, and he, at the point when he has to follow through on his threat, then turns around and changes his policy.
That's his first term.
That's right. Well, that's the first half of his first term. He then has another turnaround on China policy also that involves Taiwan. Both of these back and forths, or flip-flops, about face, if you choose the book title, took place in his first term of office.
Is that where the title comes from, about face?
Yeah, although not in no way specific to Bill Clinton. I mean, Richard Nixon, the anti-communist, does an about face on China. Virtually every political leader ends up doing an about face, and the political parties do too. So if you look right now, for example, it's the Democrats defending the status quo on China policy, the Republicans as the tough on China party. Of course, in 1990-92, the period you were asking about, it was precisely the reverse.
Is there a punning title or a punning effect in the title as well?
Well, yeah. There is the Chinese concept of face, meaning sort of pride. I'm not sure I believe in the concept, but that's certainly one of the concepts that is often used in describing China's approach to negotiations.
U.S.-China relations the last several years have been focused on another number of other factors. Trade, MFN, human rights continue to come up. Now we have a couple new issues, that of Chinese influence in U.S. elections and missiles. Chinese alleged espionage in the United States regarding missile technology. In your book, the 1996 campaign is the chapter. You write that China has a considerable ability to help or hurt any president running for re-election. How so?
Well, you can either have, much as those American politicians, when we talked about the early 70s, want smooth relations with China during a trip. In general, China can help an American politician by having what looked like amicable, mutually productive relations, or having a real nasty contretemps in the middle of an election year. And in the case of Bill Clinton in 1996, from the late spring on, there were really very smooth relations between the United States and China on all fronts, and particularly helpful, China makes sure it works out with the United States a deal on intellectual property rights, something that's very important to the software, entertainment industries. The business community gets a good deal from China as well.
After the Chinese delegation that's visiting the United States leaves the country, what do you think the headlines are going to be? What's the story when this delegation to the United States wraps up?
Well, I think probably, you're talking about Premier Zhu Rongji's visit. We'll see whether there's a deal to get China into the World Trade Organization. If there is, or if that deal falls apart, either way, that's the main story of this trip.
You speak,
I think.
You speak critically in your book to the degree that it's an analysis, that the United States has based a lot of its U.S.-China policy on an interaction of personalities. Is that beginning with Kissinger and Nixon? Is that still the case, do you think?
I think it is still the case, although less so. China seems to prefer to deal with this and to build up one single individual within the government whom it will deal with. And just as Henry Kissinger was that person, now Sandy Berger is that person. I would say really it's not nearly as secretive as it was then, and certainly the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, isn't entirely cut out of China policy in the way that William Rogers was. That would be certainly unfair to her. That's not true.
But there have been an exceptionally small number of individuals in this 30-year period, United States individuals, who have been involved over and over with the formulation and execution of U.S. policy toward China.
That's right.
Many of them Kissinger protégés.
Well, yeah, I point out in the book that people don't think of him this way, but he's almost the leader of a clan in both Republican and Democratic administrations. So it's quite interesting if you look who becomes Secretary of State in the Reagan administration. It's Alexander Haig, who works for Henry Kissinger, who had worked for Henry Kissinger. Then you take a Democratic administration. Well, and then in 1989, you have two former Kissinger aides, Brent Scowcroft and Larry Eagleburger, as National Security Advisor, Deputy Secretary of State. So that's the Republicans. You get a new Democratic administration that takes office in 1993, and the National Security Advisor is Anthony Lake, who's worked for Kissinger but resigned for policy reasons. But he is a former Kissinger protege, and Winston Lord, another former Kissinger protege. So he built up a coterie of people in China policy whose original introduction to China was with and through him.
Is this your first book?
It's not. I did one other book about 10 years ago that was about America's business relations with China. It's called Beijing Jeep. It was about what was then American Motors, now Chrysler's joint venture in China.
How has this book changed your understanding, if at all, of U.S.-China relations?
Well, the last book was really a narrative done mostly through interviews. This book, doing this book, forced me to go back and pay attention to archives, records, to really look into the history of the years before I was ever involved in covering American policy towards China in the 60s and 70s. So in that sense, it's tremendously broadened my familiarity with the relationship.
Have your views changed at all about how U.S. foreign policy is created and executed?
No, I don't think so. I think the way it looked when I went in, which is that it's part policy, part personalities, part incident, anecdotes, is the way it looked when I came out.
The title of the book is About Face. It was published by Knopf in 1998. Do you know how it's selling?
Pretty well, I think. Was for a week on a bestseller list in Los Angeles.
Author Jim Mann, who's also the foreign policy columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.